Hey guys, Al here, Vitalize Seed. I hope everybody's having a good Sunday. The video I wanted to do today was on higher pHs and what are some options we have. So over the weekend, I had looked at quite a few soil tests, and actually, I wouldn't say this is the norm, but several were above 7 pH, and I've actually dealt with that on some of the properties that I manage. So it can be a little frustrating because it's a little bit more difficult sometimes than just discerning what type of lime to use. You kind of have to come up with a plan as to, what is the best way to handle that particular soil type. And we're going to talk about some of those things today. So number one, I always want to mention that, you want to look at things like, okay, pH, what's the organic matter in the soil? It's going to give you a rough idea of, if you have a really high organic matter and high CEC, we're going to kind of know, nutrients in the soil profile before looking at any, or at least a potential for nutrients in the soil profile. The other things I want to look at is base saturations. We want to be able to see, what is the calcium, what's the magnesium. Maybe we can discern there, what's driving that pH up and or keeping it low in the case of a more acidic soil. But in the case of a higher pH soil, it can be very frustrating because it's not as easy as just, hey, let's put high cal lime on or dolomitic limestone and get the pH up. It's actually the inverse of that, right? You want to lower that pH over time. Some of the things that can happen is obviously the use of cover crops and good soil health practices over time, can benefit soils. And that's something that we obviously are going to do pretty much regardless of pH range. We want to, follow those practices. Sometimes people will say, well, elemental sulfur, it gets oxidized by microbes, but it goes through a redox reaction, it gets oxidized by microbes, and it becomes sulfuric acid, which is obviously low pH and would acidify a alkaline soil. We need to keep in mind, though, that there are other factors to that. So, for example, in the southeast, in a low CEC soil, that might be something that's used more frequently in the case of a soil having an alkaline condition. Maybe there was too much of something put down that created that situation, or naturally it was an alkaline, whatever, right? They might use that elemental sulfur, and they have good drainage, lower CEC, so they're more likely to be able to add elemental sulfur and still have that positive impact on pH reduction. In heavier soils and higher CEC soils, and or in the situation of like a garden or a food plot where you're not typically having tile ran and you're not 100% sure of the drainage, it might not be your best option. So I want to keep that in mind because we don't have to necessarily lower the soil pH immediately. It's a good goal to have, and we can come up with some plans. But I don't think that there seems to be this huge focus on pH all the time, and it certainly is helpful. Obviously, with the chart behind me, you can see how it impacts nutrient availability. That chart assumes that all the nutrients are already in the soil profile. It's another video for another day, but it does impact nutrient availability from the pH of the soil, obviously. So when we're deciding on what we want to do, we can look at also, okay, are we adding manure? Well, what's the manure's pH? And at what rate are we adding the manure? Maybe that's an option that over time, we're going to add some manure twice a year, once a year, or whatever, and continue to sample and see how that impacts the soil pH over time. So I wanted to just keep this in mind, guys, because what you can do is, let's say you have an 8 pH soil and you plant the crop, but the crop seems like it's maybe struggling, and you're thinking, well, I have a high CEC, I have a high pH, I have good organic matter. I don't think that I'm struggling with, my macros, my NPK. Well, just by this chart alone, right? Let's say you didn't get a full soil test, so you don't know your macros. We could make a pretty darn good assumption that you're likely lacking some micronutrients. So now we can come in and add the vitalized micros right before planting, at the time of planting. You could put them on over the top. You could get a foliar spray of micronutrient fertilizer, and so on and so forth. And the same idea goes for a lower pH, right? If you see things are struggling, which is more common, and that's why people tend to lean to, especially east of the Mississippi River, tend to lean to, NPK applications and see that response as far as just when you're talking about correlation to pH. So hopefully this helps you out, guys. I mean, don't just jump on the first thing you read like, oh, elemental sulfur, that's going to be my saving grace for lowering pH. There's certainly articles out there that are going to highlight that it has worked for people, but it is site specific, just like most information. So before you go out there and spend money on something, take a good soil sample. Let's look at the full picture. And if you like this stuff, guys, please check us out at vitalizeseed.com and give us a share, follow along, subscribe. We sure do appreciate you, and we really enjoy putting this information together. I hope you all have a good Sunday.